Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the second Games Insight Month session that we're running at Ukie. This one's hosted or in partnership rather with Skillsearch, which is very exciting. We're going to be looking at a data-driven look into job satisfaction in the UK games industry. So yeah, without further ado, I'd love to introduce Richard Fisher from Skillsearch to lead this session. And what I would say is we have a Q&A box at the bottom and a chat as well. I'll try and sort of field questions throughout, but probably best to stick to that Q&A box if you can. That'd be fantastic. Wonderful. Yes, Richard, without further ado, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I'll hand over to your capable hands.
Thanks so much. The dog's decided to join in backgrounds the exact minute. So apologies and thank you for joining everybody. I hope at least one of you is in the shade in the garden somewhere on a day like this, because it is absolutely boiling. But let me just jump through, not halfway through, to the beginning of my presentation. So you're probably all aware that Skillsearch is a recruitment business. So when I'm looking at the data, please be mindful that it's got the filter of recruitment over it. So I'm going to be talking about people, job satisfaction. What I'm not going to be talking about is salary bandings, or anything else that drops out of our survey. So the data should be clear that's come from our salary survey. And it's the 11th year that we've run our salary survey. And we've got more and more relevant data as the years go by, thankfully, because we've got more and more people that complete the survey. But as I said, over the years, the survey's developed. This year, we've got a section on EDI that Ukie asked us to cover. Hopefully, you've seen it, but if not, we'll talk about it slightly later in the chat. But as we've got oodles and oodles of data, we've broken it down into some geographical regions as well. It means that the final report is a 81, 82-page behemoth. So what I'm doing is I'm looking at plucking out some of the pages. The pages you're going to see as part of the presentation are directly lifted out of the survey itself. Can be found on our website, or message me if you want a copy. And I've plucked out the pages where I think there's some interesting data. Partway through, I segue briefly to a partner of ours, a company called My People, and I steal some of their data with their permission to talk about work from home specifically. But the rest of it all is from feedback that you guys have given in our survey. And what I'm hoping is, out of the end of it, particularly if you're in a position where you lead teams or you lead a business, that you'll be able to get some, although it might not provide solutions, hopefully it will provide some areas that you might want to look at a little more closely, because some of the numbers I find, frankly, staggering. That said, I did want to talk briefly about redundancies. So talking about something that isn't staggering, because I think that everybody is aware that we've been hit hard by redundancies over the last 2 years. That's game studios, that's recruitment businesses in games like mine. And the impact of redundancy has been fairly significant. But I wanted to lift out a couple of things that in the survey about redundancy. Firstly, that 20% of the people that we surveyed were affected. Some to the extent that the studio was completely closed down. Some not affected directly, and some their studio wasn't affected at all. What I found interesting was that the people made redundant, the vast majority, 65%, were those that had joined a company within the last 12 months. So it makes sense that for most companies, the last people in were the first people out. But in terms of time in the industry, I found it incredible that the vast majority of those were people that were over 5 years worth of experience. And that may be, I don't have all the answers, but that may be because they cost the most, um, as well as being the last in. But it shows there's a lot of great people that were pushed out into the market. Thankfully, over here on the right, 55% of those have found a new job since being made redundant. But the knock-on effect is that a lot of people are considering leaving the industry as a result of the redundancies, 35%, and 32% of people surveyed, although they weren't directly affected by the redundancies, still feel insecure in their role. So the thing I kind of, I wanted to share this is important to be mindful, particularly if you lead people, that even if your business wasn't touched, people might still feel a little bit uncertain. One of the other impacts that, isn't anything to do specifically with games redundancies, but just life and the challenging conditions that we live in the moment is cost of living. So again, the reason I'm sharing this is that the vast majority of people have some real concerns over affordability of life. So as an employer, we need to be mindful that people are getting stressed about, being able to save for later life. They're stressed and it's making an impact on their mental health and it's impacting their current savings. And I think, the vast majority of us are probably in this boat. But it's important to understand that, it's a shared experience. Even if you can't fix it, it's important to acknowledge that this is the situation that many of us are in at the moment. The top three strategies, the easy one, if you're an employee, is a fix, but not so easy as an employer when there's downward pressure on all of us, is increased salary. Flexibility of work location, so it's cheaper for people to do their job, although flexibility and work location is a theme I'm going to come back to a few times during this conversation. And one of the relatively inexpensive ways of supporting people is through employee assistance pay rise, employment assistance programs. But again, if you're running teams, you need to be aware that 53% of people that we surveyed are going to be asking for a pay rise within the next 12 months. And many, almost a third, are talking about shooting off to a different country to try and work remotely as a result of the cost of living. And I know we know this stuff, right? It's obvious, but it's borne out statistically. 78 respondents currently feeling a negative impact the cost of living. They see it lasting. 84% think it's going to last. Most people, almost half the people, are financially worse off compared to last year. And 75%, an important one, again, from an employer perspective, is they don't feel supported. That said, I said I was going to talk about recruitment because this is framed in terms of, we're a recruitment business. So we're testing the water in terms of how people feel. And there's a stat here, top right, that I draw your attention to, which is 77% of the people that we surveyed are considering job hunting in 2025. And you can see the chart. I won't go through it all. It breaks down in seniority. It breaks down in UK geography. The yes, maybe, no. So yes is people that have said, I will actively be looking for a new job in 2025. Maybe it is what LinkedIn or the passive candidate market, which is people that aren't necessarily looking for a job right now, but if they got approached by a new opportunity that might be closer to home or a better project, then they consider that shift. And it seems like a really high number, and it's really consistent with what we experienced in our survey this time last year. The intent is there. So if you're leading teams, the intent is there that if the right opportunity got presented to them, 3/4 of your team would look to move. And we need to be considerate. I apologize, I don't know the data for this now, but Average tenure in the game space about 4 years ago was 2.5 years. Because the market has been so impacted, there's been less jobs in the market. People have stayed put. And I don't know if anyone remembers post-COVID, there was a term that got phrased, which was the Great Resignation. And it didn't really affect us in games in the same way because we didn't get hit in the same way compared to other industries by COVID. But this is kind of a softer version, the Great Resignation too, that the intent is there, look for a new job when the market improves. Whether the market is improving or not remains to be seen, but the intent is there, and you need to be aware of that, because if you're aware, it might just affect how you're managing your staff. You don't assume that, because they've been with you for the long ride, through this sticky period, that they'll stick. And hopefully through some our other fact sheets, you'll get a feel for what will make someone leave and what will make someone stay. So moving into what might be the reason for someone to change job. I've been recruiting for 30 years, and it is very rare that I've said to someone, why are you looking to leave? And someone says straight off, it's money. I want more money. It's normally framed in another way, but the data always bears out that financial remuneration is a key driver for someone leaving. In fact, few people would leave a job, join another job to take less money, unless it's an extraordinary project. Secondly, though, concern about the future security of the company, and apologies, I've just realized the typo there, but something to consider, that people are worried about the security of their company. Could it be that people have nothing to worry about, that hasn't been communicated properly by your organization? Maybe they should be worried. But there might be a scenario where someone's thinking, okay, we're fine. People have nothing to worry about in my organization. But if that's not fully communicated to your team, it's going to add to this concern and fear. And then, one thing that's always stand alongside financial remuneration, there's a general drive to look for better or more challenging projects. So if I take you to bottom right here, considering how tough last year was, 60% of the people that responded were offered a job in 2024. It seems like a crazy statistic. I should add that a few of those jobs came by us, right? It was people going direct in the market. 31% of them turned them down. And the reason I think that stat's important is that if you employ staff, mostly the first you really find out that someone's unhappy is when they resign. And then you're either in a battle to replace if they need replacing, you're going to have to go through a hiring process again, or you'll be running around going through the process of creating a counter offer to try and encourage them to stay. So something to be mindful of, that this is about, this data hopefully will give an indication as to what's happening under the surface of all of our organizations. That not everybody's going to be happy. That there will be people in your business that potentially got offered a job last year but turned it down. And the reasons they probably turned it down was for financial reasons. They, took a look. They wanted to stay and finish what they're doing, or the job wasn't what they were expecting. And I guess there's a lesson there for us when we're on the other side and we're the companies that are doing recruiting, that it's important that there's clarity on the spec and what's being taken to market. But I just want to highlight as well, 8.7% talk about more remote or flexible working, because I'm going to move on to that in a second. So I'm going to jump out of our data stack now and talk about data from a partner of ours called My People. If you're not familiar with My People, they are a culture assessment tool. And they come from the world of sport. They work with when the British cycling team suddenly became the best team in the world, pre-Olympics, they work with elite sports people and sports teams. And they basically used that data, which was, you find that there was a limit on physical performance, how far you could drive someone physically. And culture turned out to be the thing that was the missing factor that just lifted Team GB's performance. And they've taken that product and built it into a product they're bringing to the general market. And the reason I'm talking about them is that they've got really strong data on remote working based on around 50,000 data points, much broader than the data that we have. And on average, we see that there's a significant improvement in tasks for people that are working remotely versus those in the office. So when you've got a fixed task to do, the data bears out that it's brilliant to not do that in the office. So when employees or potential employers are saying, I want to work remote for these reasons, it's often based around the task improvement. Obviously, quality of life costs as well, but the big positive is you can be better at completing tasks. But that needs to be caveated with some of the negatives that are relevant from a company perspective. So individually, it can create job boredom. It can create a higher rise in burnout. Statistically, there's a 20 to 30% drop in team cohesion, which often is it's a result in, or it's probably a result of poor communication, people solo operating, the potential of a higher degree of mistakes and a higher degree of stress. And I know it's extremely unpopular when companies announce that companies that have been fully remote are working towards a return to office. But hopefully, this data explained why that has happened. We're seeing it continue to happen, and why, if you're an employer, you need to be really mindful of how you manage remote workers effectively. I'm not saying it's impossible, by the way. I'm saying that kudos for the people that do it really effectively. Because the flip side of that, of course, from an employment perspective, is that if you've got employees doing a job at home and it's task-based, because that's where it's most effective, and there's not a great deal of team cohesion, then it's really easy for someone else to step in and go, okay, I can offer you the same job in the same location at home, but pay you £10,000 more. And people are going to take that because they're less engaged. That whole thing about purpose-led businesses, the whole water cooler moments when you really engage and you love the people you work with, that all disappears. So it can make people want to leave if they're on site. To a degree, it makes them less likely to leave. It's a balancing act. I'm not saying don't do full remote. I'm saying it's a balancing act. And it's when I read data like this, I'm empathetic to companies that say, this just isn't working for us, the full remote thing. So we've got to work on a hybrid solution. Okay, recruitment. So believe it or not, people are still recruiting. And we, through our survey, asked people how they feel about the recruitment process. Even if you're not recruiting now, if you're involved in the recruitment process, which an amazingly high amount of our respondees were, 40+%. Here are some of the aspects that people look for. Job description, being accurate is the absolute number one. If you remember a couple of slides back, people turned down jobs because they weren't, sold what they thought they were seeing. It ends up being something different. The second, we can't escape remote working. From a Skillsearch perspective, they are the easiest jobs to fill for us. And then money. So that's what people are looking for. Seems to be a fear if we're advertising on LinkedIn or some of the job places to put salary on there. But people want to see it, or at least understand it as what it is as soon as they can during the process. So what people get most frustrated with during the recruitment process is, firstly, lack of urgency. someone goes to the effort of sending in their CV, they either send it in direct or they speak to a recruiter, the confirmation of their CV submission gets made, and they don't hear. So tying into that is bad comms. It's a coverall, but that also includes, the quality of the feedback they get. And you'll see at the bottom here, the majority of people feel that they rarely receive helpful feedback post-interview. Often the interview process is too lengthy. Feedback's too slow. There's too many tests, or the questions are irrelevant or unfair. And it's a massive part of what we do, and it interests me hugely because the vast majority, vast majority of, or let me rephrase that, a lot of the clients that we work with, the recruitment process is a beauty parade, and somebody gets rolled out at different stages. But quite often it's like, meet this team, meet this other part of the team, and HR, then the big boss. And there's quite a lot of overlap because, it's kind of there's a lot of overlap in terms of the questions they get asked. And the big risk of interviewing like that is unconscious bias. Someone gets rejected because, or someone, maybe the other way, someone moves forward fast in the process. And if you're really honest, it's because they kind of remind you of that person that you work with that was really good, and they remind you a bit of themselves. Problem is, you don't recognize it because it's unconscious. Smarter companies interview based on competencies. So every job description is supported by a list of competencies that somebody needs. And when people interview, it's based on, okay, I'm going in there with a view of trying to find out the answers to these competency questions. And then the next person probably has a different set of competency questions, or there might be some overlap if that first person didn't get that competency question answered satisfactorily and they want it double checked. The best companies out there are able to interview based on competency and culture. And it's much harder to interview based on culture. Everybody talks about it. We've got a strong culture, harder to define, and even harder to interview against that. Which is why I mentioned kind of my people, but there are other tools out there, and we use them internally, that help us tackle that culture piece. The competency bit is actually fairly straightforward when you implement it. But the culture piece, once you overlap it, becomes a really powerful tool in terms of shortening the interview process. You can tackle it with urgency, and it means the feedback you can offer, because you've got competency questions people aren't scoring against, or cultural questions, they might not score well against. It means people can get more beneficial and more helpful feedback after the interview. So just some stuff there to think about. What we do with some clients is an hour-long recruitment strategy assessment. It's a free thing that we do to help people kickstart. Use us for that process, as in the recruitment process afterwards or not. It doesn't matter. It's a free thing that we offer. In terms of timescales, likely timescales to the size. CV response 2 to 7 days. I was actually surprised some of these were so long. 2 to 7 days. Some people are happy with 7 days. In terms of kind of interviews and feedback, 7 days, but the full process lasting a few months, offers turning around in 48 hours seem to be fairly consistent. So a mix of timescales that people are happy with. We have as a recruitment addict, all recruiters know that time kills, placements. And yes, it's kind of super crude, but if stuff takes too long, people get more offers in the mix, particularly if you're looking at that. Remember I said about the kind of the candidate market, people looking for jobs. There's the active market and there's this passive market. The passive market, if someone is passively looking and they go for an opportunity, it often triggers them to be an active participant and actively go out for other opportunities. That's often where things can fall down if it takes too long. So easy and nice. These were questions that the Ukie team asked us to include. They published these separately, so I'm not stealing anything that they haven't already shown you guys. But I thought there was some really interesting stuff in here that's worth just running through. The feedback that sorry, let me just jump back a page. My kind of read of these stats is that you've got outliers, right? Where people still, too much of the market, 18% of those that we surveyed don't believe their company supports and encourages ED&I. More people aren't sure. Around half agree or fully agree. But what I find interesting actually is the section where it says that the leadership encourages EDI. They somewhat agree, fully agree. But when you flip that to active steps, the vast majority of people either disagree or aren't sure. And that for me reads as the kind of headline I take from it is that in the main, people are really, are really pro ED&I. But when it comes to the execution, they don't really know how to do it. And, looking at this in terms of creating a culture that allows staff to be themselves at work, 50% fully agree. I would hope if you're running a team that almost everybody that runs a team would want to fall into this category. That means that 50% don't. And I think that's, again, from a retention perspective, where a lot of this is coming from, the data that I'm giving you, if 75% of your team is at risk of leaving, the data that I'm giving you will hopefully help you understand or question some of the things, processes you do, some of the way that we run the business to improve your staff retention. Hopefully, you'll look at it and go, what, we're brilliant at these things, but the data kind of says different. So in terms of kind of fully agreeing, I think most of us want to be on the left side of that pie chart, too much on the right. Kind of scarily jumping ahead a little bit on ED&I. Most people feel that on this pie chart that things are going to stay the same in the next 12 months. I know there's been some really, kind of even pre-Trump there in the States, there were some really loud noises about big corporates kind of reducing their ED&I efforts. And we've not really seen that in the UK, but most people think it's going to stay the same. And also, it's just some interesting data there about encouraging people to apply from diverse backgrounds and support for women in the workplace, which was, I guess, stronger stats in terms of 15% disagree, 35%, 34% not sure, but 50% agree in some capacity. So I'm going to finish off with just two fairly quick slides. The first is we asked people about what's happening moving forward. Now, I've got to caveat that with most of the data that we capture is wrapped up by mid-Jan, and then it takes about 6 weeks to produce the full document and then publish it. So what we're looking at is data that was kind of captured, most of it pre-Q1 this calendar year, despite the fact we're 4 months in, so partway through Q2. So studio priorities, leading with new games, followed by looking at new tech. AI is going to feature heavily on that. Marketing, then followed by recruitment, thankfully. Top 3 opportunities for studios, developing new game tech, user-generated content, and just the growth of mobile gaming. And the top 3 challenges for studios: budget, market oversaturation, and trying to develop something that's genuinely innovative. Looking ahead from a recruitment perspective, there was a lot of people, 48% of the people we served there, 48% of the people we surveyed said their company recruited last year. So still, said a high amount. Current priorities, it's an interesting, we look at this, and I'm always interested by the feedback that the common theme I'm still hearing, despite all the redundancies, is that securing candidates with the right technical required skills and experience is still a challenge. And finding, top talent, hiring for cultural fit is a really important factor. But bear in mind that, there's a cost impact. Even if you haven't used a recruitment agency, there's a fairly significant cost impact to hiring someone that doesn't work out. So it's important to get that right. And cultural fit often features as one of the key priorities. And the top challenges, they're the priorities. The top challenges kind of mirror that. Finding candidates with the right technical skills, finding people, again, aligned with company and culture and values. I know I keep talking about it, but what is your culture and values? Is it just something that you've had printed off and stuck on as a nice piece of wall art and is on your website? Or is it something that is actually tangible that you can measure against in terms of potential new hires and measure how much existing hires are brought into your culture and values? That diverse range, limited availability of local talent. We think about the impact in the UK of Brexit and the impact that's happened in terms of multinational teams of being able to hire the best internationally. The fact that, when the market's good in the UK, it's a limited pool of talent. We don't seem to want to train and develop from a junior level. So often, when we're at our busiest, it means we're kind of putting people from, at that level from other companies in the industry. Kind of the industry eats itself when the market's particularly busy. And finally, looking ahead, so this is in terms of headcount growth, so recruitment. So, and I said, bear in mind that the question we asked was basically, when do you think recruitment's going to kick off again and we can anticipate growth? And we may laugh about this, but 18% said that Q1 was going to be the quarter that things started to happen, but the general majority have been Q2, Q3, with a slowdown Q4. Interestingly, we did see a bounce back in Q1 in terms of our statistics internally. At the moment, it's too early to tell whether that's going to continue into Q2. It seems to have been fairly static. In terms of studio growth, 6% people thought that team was going to decline. 9% thought there's going to be no growth, but the vast majority of people thought there was going to be growth. The majority of that between 0 and 10%, and tailing off for people that might thought 5% still thought their teams might grow over 30%. So this is, as I said, this is the end of last year, and time will tell if we've just had an end of year, 2024. My God, it can't be any worse than 2024, but we probably felt that in 2023. So time will tell whether it's just general optimism or people's opinions are found in more than that. But as I said, we saw a bouncing Q1, not a major one. I wouldn't say 18%, maybe 10% bounce in terms of how busy we were. And that seems to be fairly static at the moment. But we've just come off of Easter. Maybe things will pick up. And that is basically all I have to cover. So, Leo, I accidentally closed the Q&A box. So maybe that people had loads of questions, but I just didn't have it open.
No, that's okay. So we don't have any questions at the moment, but I suppose I've got a couple. I've wondered from your perspective, sort of how employee benefits sort of factor into this story. Are you noticing a trend for more sort of thinking outside the box in terms of ways to entice and encourage and ensure employees sort of stick around, that isn't just sort of salary increases and monetary value, things like parental leave, healthcare, those sorts of things. Is this within the scope of your research?
There is. If you see the full survey, we've got a couple of slides on benefits that people expect or that they receive. I think generally, benefits are just whistles and bells. They're the nice to have. If you've not really, if you've not got a clear vision that you're communicating, so everyone's bought into that vision. If you've got great managers and not crap managers, So you work really hard on that kind of coaching style of management rather than the top-down tell type of management. And you've got a really strong understanding of your cultural values. That's going to outweigh any whistle or bell. But I hear you, parental leave, it's a really nice to have. The supporting people with their mental health. People really appreciate that stuff. Vitality Healthcare or PHI. We run a bunch of these things, and really, people really value these things. But there's no one size benefit that everybody's happy with. Parental leave. That's not going to bother in my business, it's not going to bother probably 90% of people that aren't parents. So it's nice if you reach that point or when you reach that point, but irrelevant otherwise. So I think it's good to have a mix of benefits, but that's not, I think, it's not what's going to ultimately keep your retention figures really high.
Okay, no, that's helpful to understand. I mean, I think as well, sort of maybe thinking along those lines. Have you in terms of those sort of EDI policies that you were sort of looking at? I mean, it's been quite a while since I've applied for a job, but do you find people are advertising the policies alongside their positions that are available? Is that something that you're seeing a trend of, or something that you're not seeing a trend of?
Yeah, no, I don't think we see that. Normally, ED&I forms like just a kind of like a disclaimer at the end, a
Mm.
statement. Um, I wonder how many companies out there are, for example, using ChatGPT to say, can you look at the job I'm just about to post and make sure I'm not including any unconscious bias in terms of the way it's worded? And I think it's just simple stuff like that that we can manage to improve our ED&I from a really base level basis. But quite often,
Mm.
it's like, oh, well, I've put the expression on there saying, we're an equal, opportunity provider. We want to encourage people from diverse backgrounds. That's not the same thing as publishing job ads in the pink press. It's not the same thing as actively going out there and targeting different demographics. You can do a lot of funky stuff around demographics if people are going to market using LinkedIn. There's some really proactive stuff that you can do. Probably not with the baseline LinkedIn packages though. It's the type of thing you can do when you spend tens of thousands of pounds on LinkedIn, like I have to every year. I don't know if everyone is aware of this, but there's a product called LinkedIn Recruiter. And the recruiters are LinKIN's biggest revenue stream globally. So it's a recruitment platform, I'm afraid. Um, so, there's data that you can pull down to actively target. And I think from an ED&I perspective, saying is our policy attached? Will people read it? I don't know. It's kind of a nice to know, but it's the nuanced stuff that makes all the difference in ED&I. Targeting the right place, actually directly targeting it, speaking to an audience, and making sure that you're not going out to market with any unconscious bias, which I think is the most common thing.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got a sort of question along these lines in the chat there. So, asking if labels such as "great place to work" have any I suppose, weight when it comes to attracting sort of potential candidates. I mean, I suppose there are metrics, aren't there? There's sort of great place to work metric that's
Yeah,
out there, isn't there?
well, okay, yes, but let's be clear on things like great places to work. Is that people? It's like people enter, they pay to enter. Those things cost money. So great places to work is a great thing to have, but it's also, a organization generates cash, and a canny person will go, wouldn't it be great if we can publish great places to work? Our marketing team are going to make sure that everybody fills it in and says fantastic. Um, the label itself is meaningless if it's self, applies. Yes, if you've got great places to work, you can use that little ident, but still, I'm cynical, right? I'm not saying I wouldn't like great places to work Skillsearch, but I'm slightly cynical with it. Um, there's Glassdoor, that is probably more prolific in for it's more US, right? People really track Glassdoor as a potential for potential employers more so than in the UK. But Glassdoor's not perfect. We had a really poor review of someone who said food's terrible. They clearly were getting this mixed up with a completely different organisation in Brighton. I was like, yeah, you try and engage with them and you don't get anything back. And it might be, you're going to hear the disgruntled employees. You need to be kind of brave on that. I think it would be better going to market if you had a series of testimonials where your staff are saying it is a great place to work for these reasons, or encourage
It's a really,
people,
really
of
good,
course, to come and
really
reach
good
out
way
to
to
some
do
of the
it.
staff. Go and find them on LinkedIn, reach out to them, and ask them.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Richard. We'll pause the recording there, and thank you everyone for coming along. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.